Leo Tolstoy. When he was still a young man, Leo Tolstoy said, "There is something in me which compels me to believe that I was not born to be like everybody else." He was not like everybody else, and in fact, he wasn't like anyone else. Most people know Tolstoy as the author of the epic Russian novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Most people know he was one of the greatest and perhaps the greatest novelist of all time. Yet the classic books of Tolstoy are but one aspect of an extraordinary life, a life lived in a desperate search for the truth and for human perfection. Tolstoy is a man who struggled almost from childhood against the circumstances and nature of his own being. He was born a nobleman, a count, and yet he rejected elitism. He was born on a lavish estate, yet he denounced private property. He inherited great wealth and became even wealthier through his work, yet he tried to dispose of his money and material possessions. There were hundreds of serfs on his land, but he abhorred oppression. The life of leisure and luxury was his for the asking, yet he chose to toil in the fields with the peasants. He was a man of enormous passions and vitality, who adopted a life of denial and asceticism. And from the time he was young, he was filled with a longing for God. Yet he spent many years praying to know if God was real. And all of this he did because he was a man dedicated to finding and living the higher purpose of life. His quest caused him severe anguish and suffering. Tolstoy was prone to deep black depressions, to outbursts of anger and frustration, and to mental torment so agonizing that he often thought he had gone insane, as did those around him. But in the end, he produced not just masterpieces of fiction, but a life that has served as an inspiration to thousands of others, political idealists, philosophers, educators, and ordinary seekers on the path to truth. The unusual life of Leo Tolstoy began on September 9, 1828, on his family estate near Moscow called Yasnaya Polyana, which means clear glade. It was a wonderful place to spend one's childhood. There were thousands of acres in the rolling countryside, a river for swimming or catching crayfish, lakes that froze in winter for skating, forests filled with wild game, ponies for riding, and the big white mansion with its porticos and many windows that looked out over the wooded hills. In the house were 30 servants, and outside were the cottages of the hundreds of serfs who worked the fields and forests. Serfdom had been accepted as a normal way of life in Russia for many centuries when Leo Tolstoy was born. The czars, the nobility, and the church held immense power over the serfs, who each year grew deeper in debt to their masters. Many serfs owned a hut and a small piece of land, but they themselves were owned by the family of the estate. Anything they produced on their little plot had to be shared with the master. These masters could buy and sell them, control their marriages and their lives. Some, but not the Tolstoys, regularly flogged the serfs as punishment for misdeeds. Leo and his 3 brothers and sister were descended from a long line of aristocrats that included princes, counts, diplomats, governors, generals, and politicians. Leo's mother died when he was 2, giving birth to his little sister, Maria, so he had little memory of her. But his father he always remembered, a handsome and charming man, always surrounded by pipe smoke and always willing to listen. Leo also always remembered a childhood game he played with his brothers. They would search in the woods for hours at a time for an imaginary green stick that had the secret of world peace and happiness inscribed in it. Leo took the game so seriously that, in his mind, the stick ceased to be imaginary. When he was an adult, he wrote, "We called it a game, but really everything in the world is a game except that." As a child, and even as an adult, Leo Tolstoy found himself ugly. He sat in front of a mirror trying different expressions he hoped would improve his looks. He had small gray eyes that were close together, bristly hair, and a wide, prominent nose. Once he shaved his eyebrows off in hopes it might make him look more handsome, but then he was too embarrassed to be seen at all. There were bigger problems than vanity to deal with, however. When he was only 9 years old, Leo's father suddenly died, and the boy was suddenly an orphan. For the rest of his childhood, he was raised by a variety of kindly aunts. As with most privileged children, Tolstoy received his early education from tutors. one of them so ruthless that Tolstoy often felt his experience was where his belief in nonviolence got its start. The tutor not only whipped him, but locked him in a closet for hours at a time if he failed to do his work. When Tolstoy was 16, he finally escaped the tutor and enrolled at a university. But he was bored there. The lessons were unimaginative, and he was expected to behave like a proper young nobleman, which meant, as he described it, first and foremost, an excellent knowledge of French. The second condition was fingernails, long, manicured, and clean. The third was an ability to bow, dance, and make conversation. The fourth, and a very important one, was a constant expression of refined superior boredom. The boredom, at least, he could manage. In an effort to cure it, he joined the party crowd. He attended balls from sunset to sunrise, went to all-night drinking parties, and staggered home too late to make his morning classes. Disgusted by himself, he wrote up a list of rules for his own behavior. It was the first of many similar lists he would make throughout his life, and not the last that would have on it, "Keep away from women." At age 19, Tolstoy left the university without a degree and returned to his family estate, where he spent the first months reading and studying what he chose to study. He developed a passion for the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, especially his ideas of equality, and even wore a medallion of Rousseau around his neck. He sewed himself a shapeless robe, which he tied around his waist with a cord. Then he came up with an impassioned plan for putting some of Rousseau's and his own theories into practice. He would reform the peasants. Tolstoy set out to educate the serfs and improve their living conditions, but to his shock, they didn't seem to want improvement. He bought them new, more efficient tools, and they insisted on using their old, clumsy wooden ones. He served them more nutritional and varied meals, and they persisted in eating their old, familiar porridge. When he started classes, none of the children attended. Their parents preferred to have them help in the fields. Tolstoy finally gave up in frustration and returned to the city. He spent a period in Moscow and St. Petersburg in which he fell into a self-indulgent lifestyle of gambling, partying, and numerous affairs with women, including servant girls and gypsies. He wrote to his brother, "I went to St. Petersburg without any reason. There I have done nothing necessary, only spent a heap of money and run up debts. You can't believe how it torments me." And in his diary, the simple confession, "I am living a completely brutish life." He became so restless and dissatisfied with himself that he made the choice many young men in his position made. He joined the army. He was 24 when he joined his brother in the Crimean War, where he distinguished himself with his bravery at the defense of Sevastopol. But the war brought two major disillusionments. One was the realization that war, far from being glamorous, was wretched and brutal. And the other, more personal, was that his lust was in desperate need of control. His conduct with the girls of the mountain tribes caused many confessions in his diary. "My life is extremely disorderly, so that I do not recognize myself, and I am ashamed to live like this. Sensuality gives me not a moment's peace. Girls have led me astray. I have done much evil. I live here wasting the best years of my life. It is stupid." But the army was far from being a waste. It was in these years that Tolstoy made his first attempts at writing serious fiction, reminiscences of his youth entitled Childhood. It was accepted by an editor who had the perception to write, "It seems to me that the author is a man of talent." When Tolstoy read that, he felt he had at last found his life's work. There were two sequels to Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, and then a chronicle of his army years called Sevastopol Sketches. All were well received by both the public and critics, and Tolstoy found that he was now a famous writer, even though he was still in his 20s. The books were all known for their psychological detail, but it was the last work, Sevastopol Sketches, that broke new ground and astonished its readers with its vividly realistic depictions of the war. Instead of the usual romanticized glory, Tolstoy wrote grim descriptions of bloodbaths fought by unglamorous, ordinary men. Tolstoy never believed in heroes, and in fact, he would have taken exception to this very series, for he felt there was no such thing as greatness. He believed instead that history and events unfold as they are destined to, and people simply play whatever role is predestined for them with little effect on the outcome. By the time he was 28, Tolstoy had had enough of the army and returned to his estate, where he dedicated himself once again to reforming the life of the peasants. He set up another school, and this time it was successful. As an educator, Tolstoy was far ahead of his times. He believed that lessons should be adapted to the needs of each individual student, and that they should learn what they chose to learn, at whatever pace they could. In a magazine, he described his school. No one brings anything with him, neither books nor copybooks. No homework is set them. Not only do they carry nothing in their hands, they have nothing to carry even in their heads. They are not obliged to remember any lesson, nor any of yesterday's work. They bring only themselves and their receptive nature. Sometimes teacher and pupils are so carried away that a lesson lasts 3 hours instead of 1. Sometimes the pupils themselves cry out, "Go on, go on." When he published a journal about his ideas and experience in education and textbooks, which are known for their appealing